skies. Picture this: a lone raindrop shivering on the edge of a storm cloud, about to plunge into the chaotic ballet of Earth's water cycle. Yeah, it's a bit dramatic, but so is your morning commute, right? Before we dive in, smash that like button if you love a good splash of science, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Maybe somewhere that needs a little extra hydration. Dim the lights, grab a cup of something warm, or just a glass of water, because irony is delicious. And let's slip into the cool, metallic scent of ozone as you become that very drop, tumbling through gusty winds, feeling the sting of cold air like a tiny ice cream cone gone rogue. You'll slosh into a forest canopy, hear the soft rustle of leaves like whispered secrets, then crash into a muddy puddle that smells like a mix of garden soil and forgotten socks. Gross, but oddly comforting. From there, we'll surf river currents, dodge a fish's curious nibble, and eventually sip the salty kiss of the ocean, all while you wonder whether you're on a thrilling adventure or just a soggy commuter's nightmare. So tell me, would you rather be the drop or the one who steps in it? Let's chase that drop together and see how the planet's most humble traveler ends up shaping everything we drink, wash, and, yes, occasionally slip on, high above the world, where the air is thin and the sky smells faintly of ozone. A lone vapor particle drifts like a shy guest at a celestial ballroom. It shivers in the cold, its invisible limbs trembling against the hush of the troposphere. Sunlight pierces the gloom, painting the particle with a fleeting silver halo. The wind whispers a tease, promising a dance that could end in drama or disaster. In this lofty silence, our tiny protagonist feels the first stir of destiny. Soon, countless cousins, other vapor specks, cluster around, bumping and merging in a chaotic cuddle. Their union births a glistening raindrop, a perfect sphere that catches light like a disco ball at a 1970s party. The drop's surface shivers, trembling with the electric buzz of condensation, while a faint scent of petrichor hints at Earth's future tears. With a sudden gasp, the drop awakens to the wind's eager whisper, feeling a tug that promises movement. It's as if Mother Nature just handed it a backstage pass to the world's biggest show. Now, our drop hangs suspended, feeling both weightless and absurdly heavy, like a celebrity on a red carpet who can't decide whether to smile or scream. It tastes of nothing but the purest water, yet it carries the ghost of every cloud that ever cradled it. A mischievous gust nudges it, and the drop shivers, half laughing at the irony of being both fragile and unstoppable. The sky around it hums like a low-frequency bass line, a soundtrack for an adventure that's about to drop, pun intended, into the wild. It flexes its surface tension like a gymnast preparing for a flawless routine. Gravity, that relentless director, steps into the spotlight, pulling the drop toward Earth with a force as subtle as a cat's purr and as certain as a Netflix binge. The wind swoops in, playing the role of an over-enthusiastic stage manager, urging the drop to glide, tumble, or plunge with theatrical flair. The drop's heart, if drops had hearts, beats with the rhythm of an old-school drum solo, echoing across valleys and rooftops. It imagines itself as a superhero, capeless but gleaming, ready to crash into rivers, oceans, or perhaps a bewildered, unsuspecting passerby's umbrella. The thrill of the descent tickles its surface, turning anticipation into a fizzy, electrically charged buzz. And so the journey begins. A tumble through layers of air scented with pine, diesel, and distant campfires. The drop darts past birds that stare in bewilderment, as if questioning whether it's an alien visitor from a planet of liquid metal. It splashes onto a leaf, leaving a tiny, sparkling autograph before slipping into a puddle that giggles like a toddler in a bathtub. In that moment, the drop realizes that every epic saga is made of countless tiny episodes, each dripping with humor, danger, and the occasional selfie-style flash of sunlight. With a final sigh of satisfaction, it merges with the Earth's vast, watery tapestry, ready to be reborn in the next cloud's gossip. A sudden gust, like a mischievous toddler who stole the remote, snatches me from the lazy drift of my cloud-born cousins. I tumble through the sky, a silver needle slicing the blue, feeling the thin air whoosh past, like the opening credits of an action movie. The sun flirts with me, turning my surface into 1,000 tiny mirrors that flash back at passing hawks. Below, the world shrinks into a patchwork quilt of fields and rivers. But my destination is a whisper of green. I brace for impact, wondering if the ancient trees are ready for this uninvited guest. The plunge feels like riding a roller coaster built by Zeus. Each gust a loop, each gust a scream. Clouds part like theater curtains, releasing a chorus of thunder that rumbles in my belly like a low bass drum. The air grows colder, sharper, a splash of peppermint that makes my molecules shiver. I hear the distant chatter of insects, a buzzing soundtrack that rivals any pop hit. My descent quickens, and the scent of wet earth, rich, loamy, a hint of mushroom, begins to tease my senses. I slam into the canopy with a soft thud, landing on a leaf older than most humans' grandparents. The leaf, glossy and jade, trembles under my weight, sending a ripple of water droplets that glisten like sequins on a Broadway costume. Below, a chorus of birds chirps in applause, some shouting encore as I soak into the green sponge. The bark smells of pine resin and ancient rain, a perfume that would make a perfume maker weep. I spread across the leaf, delivering nourishment like a tiny liquid superhero. From the leaf, I slip and tumble onto a carpet of moss that feels like damp velvet under a squirrel's paw. The moss is a world of tiny hills and valleys, each bead of water a tiny pond for microscopic critters, tiny salamanders that look like they belong on a sci-fi set. The scent of decomposing leaves rises, earthy and pungent, a reminder that death and growth dance together. A beetle skitters past, its armor clinking like a tiny knight's chainmail. And I wonder if I've entered a medieval tavern of insects. I cling to the moss, feeling both comforted and slightly embarrassed about my soggy entrance. Now the real trials begin. Evaporation teases me, whispering that I could become a cloud again, a fleeting Instagram story that disappears after 24 hours. Meanwhile, the moss's roots drink me greedily, pulling me into their cellulose highways like a subway system for water. I feel a tug of irony, my grand journey from sky to leaf, now reduced to a sip of plant juice, like a superhero forced to take a coffee break. A sunbeam pierces the canopy, heating my surface, coaxing me to evaporate into a ghostly vapor that might one day return as a dramatic rainstorm in a blockbuster finale. Either way, I'm proud to have tickled a leaf, fed a moss, and survived the forest's first gritty sticky test. When the clouds finally sighed, I slipped out like a shy actor stepping onto a wet stage. A handful of my droplet cousins gathered around, and together we plummeted, merging into a glittering thread of water that could outshine a disco ball. The sun tried to kiss us, but the air was still cool enough that we felt like mischievous ninjas in a slapstick chase. We giggled as we slipped over the forest floor, our tiny bodies colliding, forming a chorus of tiny bubbles that sang a bubbly tune. It was the beginning of a river-bound adventure, and even the squirrels paused to stare, as if asking, "Did you just see that?" Soon we hit the first rocky riff, where smooth stones jutted up like ancient piano keys. We bounced, sang, and sometimes splashed into each other's faces, the sound of crunchy percussion that could make a drum circle jealous. The cold, wet scent of moss clung to us, and every tumble felt like a slap from Mother Nature's own cheek. At one moment, a cheeky otter popped its head, winking at us like a magician, pulling a rabbit out of a hat, then vanished into the current. We roared past, leaving a frothy mustache on the rocks. Proud as a knight in shining armor, we swooped into a valley so deep it looked like the crater of a forgotten dinosaur egg. The canyon walls echoed our babble, turning our chatter into a low rumble that rattled the bats' coffee cups. Then came the rapids, a frothy beast that shoved us side to side, testing our resolve like a reality show obstacle. I clung to a boulder, feeling the raw spray sting my skin like a cheeky pepper spray, while my friends were tossed like laundry in a spin cycle. A sudden splash of foam sprayed a mossy moss bear's nose, and it sneezed, sending a plume of spores that smelled like earth after a summer barbecue. We survived, grinning, because nothing says, "I'm alive," like a wet tumble through chaos. Emerging from the chaos, we found ourselves on a broader stage, the mighty river, a silver serpent winding across the continent. Its banks were carved like a grand canyon made by a lazy giant with a chisel, each curve whispering legends of explorers and lost socks. The current swelled, pulling us forward with the confidence of a superhero cape, catching the wind. We passed by beaver dams that looked like tiny Lego fortresses, their wooden scent mixing with the metallic tang of faraway factories. Even the wind tried to join, singing a tune that reminded me of an 80s synth-pop ballad, though slightly out of tune. Our droplets merged into a bustling crowd, each of us a pixel in the grand picture of the river's story. At last, the river widened into a massive delta, spreading out like a lazy cat stretching after a nap. We could taste the salty kiss of the sea on the horizon, a reminder that every journey ends in a splashy embrace. The whole expedition left a faint, muddy perfume on us, the kind of scent that says, "I've been at a wild side and back." I thought of my cloud parents, wondering if they'd recognize me now, still a droplet, but now a veteran with stories taller than mountain peaks. And so, dear listeners, the Raindrop's Odyssey reminds us that even the tiniest splash can carve continents, especially if you add a dash of humor and a splash of daring. The river, after a lifelong trek through valleys and towns, finally sighs as it slides into the ocean's gaping mouth. Its waters, weary yet proud, tumble over the sandbar like a tired poet stumbling into applause. Salty air brushes the drop's cheeks, tasting of seaweed and distant diesel fumes from a fishing trawler. Seagulls cackle above, mocking the river's final gasp as if they were chorus members in a Broadway show. The scene feels like the ending of an epic saga, complete with a drum roll from the moonlit waves. The drop plunges into a tumbling maelstrom of tides that roar like a stadium crowd after a last-minute goal. Swells hurl it up and down, each crest snapping with the crack of a thunderclap, each trough smelling of kelp and the faint sting of ozone. Storm clouds charge overhead, flashing lightning that paints the water in neon graffiti, a reminder that Mother Nature still likes to surprise us. Yet the drop laughs, bubbles at the chaos, recalling the old sailor's joke about a gull that sued a wave for emotional distress. It's a wild dance, a mashup of Poseidon's power and a DJ's remix. Around the drop, schools of fish dart like synchronized swimmers, auditioning for a SeaWorld talent show. A curious dolphin swoops past, slapping its nose against the surface in a cheeky salute, as if saying, "Welcome to the club, rookie." Crabs scuttle across the seabed, their shells clicking like castanets, while a lone octopus folds its arms in an odd yoga pose, silently judging the drama. The water is thick with the briny perfume of plankton, a scent that could make a sailor's nose twitch with delight or disgust. Even a shy sea turtle glides by, carrying the wisdom of ancient voyages and the occasional selfie stick memory of a sunken pirate ship. Deep down, the ocean's heart beats like a massive drum, reverberating through the drop's tiny core, reminding it that it's now part of something far larger than any mountain stream. The sun's heat teases the surface, turning the water into a shimmering mirror that reflects clouds like giant, lazy jellyfish. Pressure builds like a gossip column of the deep, squeezing out secrets of the abyss, while the drop feels both weightless and crushed. It's a paradox, a gentle kiss from sunlight and a stern hand from the dark trench, the ultimate tug of war between warmth and the unknown. In this climactic convergence, the drop realizes it has become a citizen of every water body, holding a passport stamped by glaciers, rainstorms, and now the mighty ocean. It swirls with the pride of a conquistador who's finally found the treasure chest, only to discover it's filled with sea foam and the occasional misplaced bottle cap. The ocean's embrace is both a hug and a splash, a reminder that every journey ends with a splashy punchline. As the tide rolls outward, the drop whispers a farewell to its river roots, promising to return as rain, as mist, or as a nostalgic splash in a child's bathtub. And with that, the story loops, ready for the next raindrop to start its own legend. When the sun stretched its golden fingers across the meadow, our humble raindrop felt a warm nudge, like a morning espresso. It quivered, shedding its liquid coat and soaring as invisible vapor, hitching a ride on the rising draft. Up above, the air crackled with a faint smell of ozone and distant pine, a reminder that even clouds have a perfume. The drop giggled, recalling its teenage years as a pond splash, now upgraded to a lofty, airy existence, high in the troposphere. The vapor gathered, with a motley crew of fellow ascents, forming a cloud that resembled a lazy cotton candy monster. The cloud's belly swelled, humming with the low-frequency thunder of distant storms, while the sun tried to roast it like a marshmallow. Our drop, now a speck in this fluffy congregation, felt the tickle of electric static and the faint scent of ozone-kissed rain on a hot sidewalk. It whispered, "Hold tight, folks. The ride's about to get gritty," as the wind began to spin its mischievous dance. Soon the cloud grew heavy, burdened by its own ambition, and began its dramatic descent, like a diva sliding down a glittering runway. The raindrop plummeted, cutting through the air with a whoosh that sounded suspiciously like 1,000 tiny applause whistles. It collided with leaves, tasting their chlorophyll perfume, and splashed onto a river where the water smelled of mud, algae, and a faint memory of a forgotten picnic sandwich. The drop laughed, realizing it had become the universe's very own splash comedy star, starring in the sequel of its own existence. At the riverbank, the drop merged with a bustling current, swirling past rocks that grumbled like old librarians, shushing noisy patrons. It felt the river's cool, mineral-rich fingers brush against its skin, while fish flicked their tails in synchronized choreography, humming the ancient hymn of survival. The current carried the drop toward the ocean, where salty breezes whispered of distant continents, and the taste of seaweed tingled on its tongue. Here, the drop paused, admiring the sprawling horizon, like a Netflix binge-watch ending, bittersweet, yet eager for the next episode. Finally, the ocean's vast embrace lifted the drop once more, as the sun's warmth coaxed it into vapor once again, completing the loop like an ancient myth retold by a campfire storyteller. It rose, feeling a faint scent of kelp and sun-baked sand, ready to join a fresh cloud, perhaps this time with a celebrity cameo, a stray seagull that thinks it's a rock star. The cycle renewed, stitching together mountains, deserts, and cities in a watery tapestry that binds the earth together. And as the drop vanished into the sky, it winked. "See you on the next rain check, folks." In the mist-cloaked highlands, a thin ribbon of water first coaxed its way from ancient glaciers, spilling like a shy teenager out of a locker. The meltwater tangled with crystal springs that locals swore were blessed by moonlit spirits, bubbling up with a scent of cold stone and pine needles. It was here that the tribe of the first keepers set up camp, their tents smelling of dried goat cheese and wet fur, eyes glittering with curiosity. They watched the newborn stream tumble over mossy rocks, its chatter louder than a gossiping marketplace. Even the mountain goats seemed to pause, as if to applaud the river's debut on the world stage. The first keepers gathered around the burling birth, chanting names like Silver Tongue and Grandmother's Whisper, each syllable snapping like a firecracker in the cool air. They carved these titles onto stone slabs, the graffiti of eternity, while a lanky elder tried to hide his fear of water by pretending it was just wet mud. Children splashed in the shallow pools, shrieking with a delight that echoed the river's own giggle, and the adults whispered promises of fertile fields. Night fell, and the campfire smoked, its orange glow dancing on the water's surface like a retro video game pixel art river. In that glow, the tribe swore an oath to protect the river, because who else would keep the world's biggest backyard hose tidy? Soon, the river's gentle sigh coaxed the first wild grasses to bend and the first weed stalks to stand, as if the water were a stern but caring mother nudging her children toward the sun. The scent of fresh earth rose, mingling with the metallic tang of iron-rich mud, a perfume that made the tribe's noses twitch like teenage dogs. They planted seed rows along the banks, each furrow a line in their growing love story, and the river answered with a steady murmur, louder than a TikTok trend, but less fleeting. Harvest festivals erupted, with dishes that smelled of sweet barley, and the occasional unfortunate goat toe that slipped into the stew, a culinary hazard that earned the nickname surprise protein. Neighbors from distant hills came to trade, their carts squeaking over stone like a chorus of nervous crabs, and the first keepers laughed, realizing they'd just invented the first farmer's market, minus the Wi-Fi. Ironically, the river that was once a timid newborn now dictated the rhythm of daily life, marching like a drill sergeant who never slept. When a summer drought threatened to shrink the flow, the tribe held a mock Star Wars council, declaring, "May the Force be with our irrigation," and then actually built a crude aqueduct that looked like a giant straw. The water rushed back, gushing over the new channel with the gusto of a rock concert opener, splashing anyone who dared stand too close. Soggy socks became a season's hottest fashion. Elders joked that the river had more mood swings than a teenage influencer, but also more loyalty than a golden retriever guarding a bone. Thus, they learned to read the river's temper by listening to its sighs, snarls, and occasional burps, each a lesson in humility and wet socks. As the years unfurled, the river grew bolder, carving valleys, carving stories, and occasionally stealing a wandering hat for good measure. The first keepers, now grandparents, watched their grandchildren skip stones that sang like tiny choirs, their reflections shimmering like ancient emojis. Even as the tribe's language evolved and their tools grew shinier, the sacred springs remained, whispering the same ancient lullaby that first birthed the stream. The river's journey from misty highlands to hungry plains became a backbone of a civilization, a tale told around firelight that smelled of smoked fish and old parchment. And so, dear listeners, remember, every great river starts as a shy meltwater teen, but with a tribe of keepers, it can become the very lifeblood of empires. Just don't forget your waterproof boots. When the river first cut its way through the cradle of the mountains, it left a scar of glittering water that sang like 1,000 whistles. The first wanderers stood on the banks, eyes wide, as if they just discovered a secret level in a video game. They tasted the fresh, metallic tang of river mud on their tongues and felt the cool spray kiss their faces. With each bend, the river whispered promises of fertile soil, and fish so plump they seemed to laugh. Soon, the valley echoed with the clatter of tools and the low hum of a civilization waking up. In the Bronze Age city of Aram, clever merchants watched the river like a seasoned coach watching a relay race. They fashioned flat-bottom barges from split oak, ceiling seams, with pitch that smelled like a campfire after a rainstorm. These wooden turtles creaked under the weight of grain sacks, goatskins, and glittering copper ornaments as they glided downstream. Farmers from the high pastures shouted greetings, their voices carrying over the water like a folk song chorus, while dock workers slapped ropes in rhythm, creating a percussive beat for the whole riverbank. The barges linked the mountain farms to lowland markets, turning the river into an unstoppable conveyor belt of commerce. At each bustling dock, the air turned into a stew of aromas: sweet baked figs, sharp onion fumes, and the smoky perfume of blacksmiths hammering away. Merchants haggled in a mashup of dialects, their words bobbing up and down like the river's current, and occasional outbursts of laughter rose like splashes against stone. Travelers from distant deserts traded silks that brushed the skin like cat fur, while locals offered honeyed mead that fizzed like a firework in the mouth. The river carried not only goods, but stories, songs, and jokes. One trader even claimed the river's current could outrun a cheetah on roller skates. By sunset, the banks glowed amber, and the river reflected a tapestry of cultures woven together by trade. If you ever wondered what the ancient world's version of Amazon Prime looked like, look no further than these river barges. Except the delivery guarantee was a splashy, muddy surprise. Irony dripped from the fact that the very water that nourished crops also threatened to drown careless load carriers, prompting a local proverb: better trust a river than a liar, for at least the water shows its depth. Occasionally, a stray goat would leap onto a barge, causing a chaos reminiscent of a sitcom cat stuck in a laundry basket. Even the priests, draped in ceremonial robes, would sigh dramatically as they watched their incense smoke mingle with the river's mist, as if the gods were live-streaming the trade show. The whole scene felt like a living tapestry, vibrant enough to make a modern influencer's Instagram reel pale in comparison. When the sun slipped behind the cliffs, the river kept humming, its surface glittering like spilled liquid gold. Traders counted their spoils, but they also counted friendships forged over shared bread and spilled ale. The river had become a living artery, pulsing with the lifeblood of countless peoples, each heartbeat echoing through the ages. As night fell, fireflies dotted the banks, and the river whispered, "Keep flowing, and we'll keep carrying stories." And so, the ancient trade artery kept beating, reminding us that commerce, culture, and a good splash of humor can change the world. The river, a gleaming bronze ribbon snaking through dust-caked plains, had become the latest prize of empires that rose and fell like bad Wi-Fi signals. From the marble-capped citadel of the Sunhammer dynasty to the jade-tiled towers of the Eastern Khanate, every ruler coveted its choke points as if they were secret cheat codes. When the notorious warlord, Karak the Knot, tied his dragon-scaled fleet across the Narrows, the water roared with a metallic screech that sounded suspiciously like a dying saxophone. Merchants cursed the smell of burnt oil and fresh blood mingling in the mist, while soldiers whispered that the river itself might be bleeding. The stage was set for a drama more tangled than the season of Game of Thrones *. In a cramped riverside tavern that smelled of stale fish and cheap ale, emissaries from the silt-washed cities of Marrowport, Willowbank, and Grayfen huddled under a flickering lantern. They swore a secret pact, sealing it with a toasted riverweed roll and a sloshing goblet, their laughter echoing off the damp wooden walls. Each city pledged to send a handful of their sharpest river runners, spies who could navigate both the tangled canals and the more treacherous corridors of politics. Loyalty, however, proved as slippery as a mud skipper. A merchant from Marrowport glanced nervously at the gold coins in his satchel, wondering if betrayal paid better than honor. Still, the alliance sparked like a lightning strike on the water's surface, bright enough to blind the schemers of the opposing empires. Night after night, coded messages floated downstream in bottles wrapped in oilcloth, their ink smelling faintly of fermented cabbage. Karak's informants, burly fishermen with crabby attitudes, tried to intercept them, only to be distracted by the river's sudden chorus of cicadas, nature's own popcorn popping. One daring scout slipped a counterfeit decree into the warlord's pantry, causing a frantic scramble for the missing salt, the prize seasoning of the army. The scent of panic rose like a sour stew, and the warlord's once proud grin cracked into a grin as wide as the river itself. An ironic reminder that even tyrants have a soft spot for spicy food. Amid the chaos, a shy poet from Willowbank scribbled a limerick about the war, and it spread faster than gossip at a royal banquet. At dawn, Karak's fleet thundered through the narrows, oars slamming the water like drums in a marching band, while smoke from their cannon fire curled up like angry eyebrows. The coalition's river runners, armed with reed spears and a surprise supply of fermented kelp that made the warship's crews retch, launched a daring counterattack from hidden coves. The clash sounded like a thunderous chorus of clanking metal, shrieking winds, and the occasional, unmistakable squeal of a badly tuned violin, because someone had brought minstrel to the battlefield. Ironically, the warlord's flagship got stuck on a mudbank, allowing a trio of mischievous ducklings to waddle across its deck, pecking at the leader's boots. By sunset, the river ran red with oil, blood, and the sweet smell of victory mixed with the bitter tang of defeat. When the last cannonball sank, with a splash that smelled like rotten peanuts, an uneasy calm settled over the water, as fragile as a soap bubble in a hurricane. The surviving leaders gathered on a floating platform, their faces smeared with river grime and sweat, to negotiate a truce that promised shared tolls and mutual respect if anyone could remember the details after the night's revelry. The river, ever the indifferent witness, murmured beneath them, carrying away the remnants of burnt parchment and the faint echo of Karak's haughty laugh. Yet the current whispered a warning. Peace here was as delicate as a cat's whisker, ready to snap at the slightest tug. And so the story of the river's conflict slipped into legend, a cautionary tale told over campfires, reminding future empires that you can't control a river. You can only learn to surf its wild, unpredictable rapids. The sky blackened like spilled ink, and the river roared awake, swallowing the lowlands in a watery fist. Thunder hammered the hills, while the water surged, dragging mud, reeds, and the scent of rotten fish up the banks. Villagers shouted, their voices drowned by the clatter of collapsing thatch and the crack of timber, snapping like twigs under a giant's foot. Even the sacred stone statues, normally serene as museum mannequins, were splashed with frothy foam that smelled of swamp and ash. The flood was no gentle poet. It was a binge-drinking god letting loose, and everyone was forced to stay dry in the chaos. Across the churning water, the river folk of the northern delta glared at the hill clan merchants, their banners soaked and flapping like bedraggled laundry. Historically, they traded insults, sharper than swords, but the rising tide turned rivalry into a shared bathtub, with makeshift rafts patched from whatever floated, old barrels, broken carts, even a discarded chariot wheel. Both sides paddled toward each other, breathing the same humid, algae-laden air. Ironically, the flood acted like a group therapy session, forcing foes to shout, "Help!" in unison instead of "Pay my taxes." The absurdity of former enemies shouting, "I've got a spare rope," made the whole scene feel like a medieval sitcom Rescue crews formed an impromptu brigade, their boots squelching in mud that smelled like a farmer's nightmare. Mixed with fermented cabbage, lanterns flickered, casting trembling shadows that danced on the water surface like karaoke-lit ghosts. The soundscape shifted from roaring torrents to the clatter of wooden beams being pried free, punctuated by the occasional guttural laugh of a soldier who slipped in a slime-covered plank and emerged covered in green muck. Children, eyes wide as saucers, clutched soggy bundles of wheat, while elders recited old river hymns, their voices muffled by the surge, but still carrying a stubborn hope. By nightfall, the flood had turned the banks into a battlefield of debris, yet the cooperative spirit cracked the ice of centuries-old grudges. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a mess of driftwood, shattered pottery, and the pungent aroma of rotting vegetables. Nature's version of a post-apocalypse cleanup crew. Leaders from both factions gathered beneath a cracked stone arch, their robes dripping, to draft a charter they called the River Pact, a document as sturdy as a dragon-scale shield, but as delicate as a reed pen. The pact stipulated who could navigate which stretch, how much tribute each trader must pay, no more than a goat per trip, because who needs gold when you've got goat cheese, and a solemn oath to keep the river clean, lest it return with a vengeance, like a Netflix binge that never ends. Ironically, the very flood that threatened to erase their histories became the ink that wrote a new one, and the council's first decree was to name the catastrophe Big Wet Down 2025, a tongue-in-cheek reminder that even epic disasters deserve a tagline. The council swore an oath louder than a stadium chant, their voices echoing off the water-slick stones, sealing the pact with a splash of river water that smelled faintly of burnt pine and triumph. From that day on, the river ran not just with water, but with stories of unity that travelers whispered over campfires, much like urban legends about a superhero who can't swim. The River Pact held firm, regulating tax boats that chugged like old trains and ensuring that the sacred reeds were tended like prized hare, never too short, never too wild. Occasionally, a rogue fisherman would test the limits, only to be rebuked by the council's sentinel ducks, who honked louder than a 90s sitcom laugh track. The flood's memory lingered in the scent of wet earth after rain, a reminder that even the fiercest tempest could melt steel-cold grudges into warm, collaborative camaraderie. And so, the saga of the Flood of Unity became the river's own legend, a tale as enduring as the current itself, proving that sometimes you have to get soaked to write history. When the ancient council finally hammered the River Pact into stone, the waters threw off their shackles and surged toward the sea like an impatient marathon runner who just found the finish line. The mighty current carried with it centuries of whispered myths, the clang of bronze gavel, and the splash of poets' ink, each ripple a tiny time capsule. Farmers downriver felt the cool breath of the river on their calves, while traders smelled the salty tang of distant ports tickling their nostrils. Children laughed as they chased foam that smelled faintly of fish and mud, unaware they were playing with the very threads of their ancestors' stories. Even the moon seemed to grin, reflecting a silver ribbon that whispered, "We made it, you stubborn humans." Generations later, elders gathered at the source, a mist-cloaked spring that hisses like a cat waking from a nap, and pointed back with gnarled fingers, reminding the crowd how water forged their first plows. They recalled a time a flood turned a bustling market into a muddy mess, prompting the first written law: do not spill your ale on the sacred banks, lest the river avenge itself. The scent of whetstone and algae conjured memories of lovers swapping vows beside the current, their promises echoing as soft as reeds, rattling in the wind. Young scribes, armed with charcoal, sketched these legends on scrolls, the ink smelling of burnt wood and riverbank smoke. Ironically, the same river that once demanded reverence now hosted a karaoke night where teenagers sang off-key ballads to the rhythm of flowing water. In the grand courts of empire, jurists invoked the river as a silent witness to treaties, citing its relentless flow as proof that promises should not dry up like a neglected well. When King Hammurabi drafted his code, a clause about irrigation was etched beside a carving of a fish with a crown, reminding officials that the law must swim as smoothly as the currents. The air in the courtroom was heavy with incense and the metallic bite of sword handle polishing, a blend that made even a most stoic scribe feel slightly seasick. Artists, meanwhile, painted the river in bold reds and blues, their palettes smelling of turpentine and riverbank pine, capturing both its fury and its lullaby. Even the court jesters couldn't resist tossing a rubber duck into the basin during deliberations, shouting, "May our debates be as buoyant as this." Across centuries, the river inspired songs that drifted from lute strings to electric guitars, each riff echoing the splash of stones skipping across its face. Modern graffiti artists tag the riverbanks with neon tags that hiss like electric eels, the paint smelling of aerosol and wet concrete, a rebellious ode to the ancient pact. Fishermen still tell tall tales about a river deity who prefers Netflix binge-watching to heroic rescues, a joke that makes the younger crews snort salty foam. At night, lanterns flicker on bobbing barges, casting amber halos that dance with fireflies, while the water hums a low bass note reminiscent of a distant bass drop in a club. The whole scene feels like a mashup of the Odyssey and a superhero movie, where Poseidon trades his trident for a surfboard. Today, citizens gather at the river's mouth, clutching protest signs that smell faintly of fresh rain and cheap coffee, pledging to shield the water as fiercely as a dragon defends its hoard. They chant slogans that riff off ancient verses, their voices rising like bubbling rapids and echoing against cliffs that have heard both war cries and lullabies. The river, ever the patient listener, carries their words downstream, spreading them to villages that still bake bread over fire pits fed by its steam, the dough rising with the scent of damp earth. Children splash in its shallows, their laughter mixing with the distant hum of cargo ships, reminding everyone that the pact is not a dusty relic, but a living, breathing agreement. And as the sun sinks, turning the sea into molten cold, the river sighs, content that civilization finally learned to love its source as much as its destination. In the waning years of the last glacial maximum, the world wore a frosted coat that scraped the sky. Snowflakes drummed on stone like a cheap drum kit, and the air smelled of pine sap and fresh-cut ice. Nomads roam the periphery, their breath fogging like a magician's trick in the cold, yet a low, distant rumble, like an over-caffeinated kettle, hinted that the glacier was about to get a makeover. The stage was set for Aruk, a chieftain with a beard as tangled as his tribe's stories. Aruk led his ragtag band of wanderers to the glacier's edge, where the ice loomed like a sleeping dragon. They pitched lean-to tents against the sheer white wall, their fire crackling like an ancient rave. Young hunters learned to read the glacier's pulse. A crack here meant a hidden crevasse, a shimmer there signaled a meltwater vein. The tribe sang lullabies to the ice, their voices echoing off the frozen cliffs, with a humor that could make a stone smile, By night, they traded tales of mammoth steaks and the occasional Game of Thrones style betrayal, except with fewer dragons and more frostbite. Morning light painted the ice in blues that would make a modern painter weep, while the wind carried the sour stench of thawing algae, nature's own version of rotten cheese. Arak's boots sank into slushy muck, sucking up the bitter taste of frozen river water that clung to his tongue like bad chewing gum. Children chased after glistening icicles, their laughter cracking through the stillness like a drum solo at a rock concert. The tribe's dogs, fur matted with frost, howled in harmony with the glacier's low sigh, a chorus that felt both epic and oddly corporate, like a motivational TED Talk delivered by a snowman. Every sensory bite reminded them they were living on a living, breathing iceberg, not a polished museum exhibit. One evening, the ground shivered as if the earth itself had just sneezed, sending a low rumble through the valley, a sound that could outdo any cinematic soundtrack. Arak raised an eyebrow, half amused, half terrified, wondering if the glacier was about to pull a surprise ending, worthy of a blockbuster plot twist. The tribe gathered around the fire, swapping stories of past melts while sipping broth that tasted suspiciously like frozen regret. Irony dripped from the situation. They had settled to avoid the glacier's wrath, only to welcome its impending melt like unwelcome guests at a dinner party. Yet in that uneasy chuckle, they sensed the promise of a new world. Water carving new roads where stone once ruled. As the first slow trickle turned to a gushing river, the valley woke up with a splash that sounded like 1,000 maracas shaking. Arak stood at the water's edge, his cloak dripping, feeling both the cold bite of the melt and the warm thrill of destiny. The tribe watched as ice cliffs melted away, exposing fertile soil that smelled of fresh earth, an opportunity, like an all-you-can-eat buffet after a long fast. They knew that the glacier's surrender would redraw borders, carve new trade routes, and perhaps inspire future empires to write their own legends. With a grin that could melt further ice, Arak whispered, "Let's see what history has in store. Preferably something with less shivering and more dancing." When the ancient glaciers finally hiccuped a sigh and began to melt, they unleashed a roar that sounded like 1,000 stone drums beating against the valley walls. Rushing torrents gouged new riverbeds where only ice once lay, carving channels as deep as a giant's thumbprint and as winding as a drunken poet's verses. The people of Arak stood on the shore, their eyes wide as meltwater mirrors, while the wind carried the metallic tang of fresh stone and the earthy perfume of wet soil. Children chased splashing foam, shouting, "Look, the world is washing its hair," and elders muttered that the gods were finally blowing their hair dryers. The whole landscape trembled under the water's relentless push, promising both peril and possibility. Soon the melt waters surged beyond the river banks, flooding Arak's low fields with a sudden, squelching deluge that smelled like soggy pine and rotting riverweed. Instead of lamenting, the villagers rolled up their sleeves, slapped mud from their boots, and began to channel the chaos into irrigation channels, their hands moving like seasoned DJs scratching vinyl. They built levees with rough timber, their muscles straining against a wet wood, while frogs croaked a frantic chorus of encouragement. Ironically, the flood that threatened to drown their crops became the very lifeline that turned the desert soil into a lush carpet of emerald sprouts. By night, the glow of fireflies danced over the newly watered fields, and the villages toasted with a sour brew that tasted of algae and triumph. Across the newly carved waterway, neighboring settlements sprouted like pop-up tents at a music festival, each claiming a slice of the sparkling river for themselves. Traders from the distant city of Kira arrived in reed-covered barges, shouting, "The early bird gets the worm and the water," as they unloaded baskets of dried figs and glittering shells. A friendly rivalry blossomed. Arak bragged about its irrigation, while Kira boasted about its fish that could practically do the Macarena on a plate. The river became a bustling thoroughfare, echoing with the clang of metal tools, the clatter of pottery, and the occasional off-key hymn from a wandering bard. Yet beneath the merriment, a subtle tension simmered, like the low hum of a furnace waiting to burst into flame. Commerce flowed smoother than butter in a summer pan, and the scent of wet earth mingled with the tangy aroma of smoked fish and fermenting grain. Merchants exchanged stories as well as goods, swapping rumors about a mysterious golden spear that gleamed like a lightsaber under the sunrise. Uruk's leaders, eyes narrowed like a cat stalking a laser pointer, plotted how to keep their water rights while stealing a few extra barrels of barley. The riverbanks buzzed with barroom brawls, where spilled ale would splash onto a soldier's armor, making him slip and shout a profanity that sounded suspiciously like a modern curse word. Yet, in the cacophony, there was a shared reverence. Everyone knew that without the Meltwater's wrath, their empires would have been nothing but frozen footnotes. As seasons turned, and the glaciers retreated into myth, the rivers they birthed continued to carve destinies, shaping empires with the same relentless vigor as a playwright scripting a drama. Aruk's people, now masters of the flood, looked out over their fields, feeling the cool, moist breeze on their faces, like a reminder that even the harshest forces can be tamed with wit and will. The neighboring towns, once rivals, now stood side by side, their flags fluttering in the same current, a living proof that water can both separate and unite. In taverns, storytellers would raise a goblet and proclaim, "We survived the ice's tearjerker, and now we're the rock stars of the river." And the river, indifferent to applause, kept flowing, carrying with it the hopes, grudges, and the occasional soggy sock of an ancient empire. When the last ice sheets sighed and melted, they left behind a ribbon of loamy floodplain that smelled of fresh earth and fish-laden fog. The river swelled like a lazy dragon, its waters carving terraces that glittered with sunrise gold. Empires with scroll-toting bureaucrats and battle-scarred kings alike stared hungrily at this bounty, dreaming of wheat fields that could feed armies. In the east, the kingdom of Lyris rose, its banners fluttering like neon stickers on a medieval Instagram feed. The locals swore the land was a gift from the gods, but they also whispered that the river could be a ruthless landlord, demanding rent in blood and tribute. Lyris's king, a thin-lipped schemer named Armand, sent his envoys to the hill-clad tribe of Aruk, demanding control of the river's main tributaries. The Aruk, whose ancestors had learned to fish with teeth and curses, reluctantly signed a pact that felt more like a hostage exchange than a treaty. They gathered around a fire that crackled like a mixtape of thunder, each tribe member eyeing the polished bronze medals of Lyris with suspicion. Armand laughed, a high-pitched chortle that reminded the tribe of a squeaky toy, promising prosperity, while secretly plotting to divert water to his own golden granaries. The fragile alliance was sealed with a ceremonial bowl of fermented goat milk, which tasted like regret mixed with dill. Soon after, the sky turned a cruel, cracked blue, and the river began to shrink as if someone had turned the universe's faucet off mid-shower. Drought clawed at the fields, turning once green stalks into brittle, ash-colored fingers that snapped under the weight of hope. Auroch's hunters, desperate, sabotaged Lyris's irrigation canals with mud-clogged logs that squeaked like a squeaky-clean skateboard. Lyris retaliated by sending soldiers who marched in perfect squares, their boots slapping the dusty earth louder than a drum solo at a rave. The two sides blamed each other for the thirst, while the river itself seemed to laugh, a low gurgle that sounded suspiciously like a sarcastic sigh. In the midst of the chaos, both parties converged on a massive glacial moraine, a pile of ancient boulders that smelled of cold stone and mildew. They began to stack timber and stone, aiming to erect a dam that would harness the dwindling water. Like a giant, soggy camel's hump, the construction site became a cacophony of hammer blows, shouted commands, and the occasional accidental splash of slime that smelled like rotten eggs mixed with pine sap. As the dam rose, so did tensions. A Ruk shaman warned that damming a glacier's legacy was like trying to trap a mythic beast in a teacup. And indeed, a crack sprouted, leaking frothy water that hissed like a kettle about to boil over. The whole spectacle resembled an epic showdown, straight out of a low-budget fantasy movie, complete with dramatic pauses and over-the-top proclamations. When finally the dam gaped open, a torrent surged through, flooding the lowlands with a roar that rattled skulls and washed away petty grievances like soggy parchment. Lyris's granaries filled to the brim, their walls dripping with sweet, river-kissed grain, while the Auroch watched their sacred river turn into a chaotic waterfall, splashing mud over their ceremonial tattoos. In the end, the kingdom feasted like they won a golden trophy, yet the river whispered a bitter joke. The very water they fought over now carried away their riches downstream to a rival tribe. Armand, dripping wet and humbled, tried to smile, but his grin looked as forced as a sitcom laugh track. The floodplain, ever generous and merciless, reminded all that nature's bounty comes with a hefty side dish of betrayal, served cold and crunchy like a glacier's shattered ice. The night the glaciers cracked, the heavens roared like 1,000 angry drums, and the lower valleys of Lyris flooded with a cold fury that smelled of wet stone and pine sap. Water surged over the city walls, ripping roofs off as if they were flimsy paper hats, while terrified citizens shouted and trampled each other in a chorus of panic. The capital's grand bazaar, once fragrant with roasted lamb and spice, became a soggy graveyard of soggy sandals and splintered crates. Even the mighty statues of the founding heroes wept, their marble faces streaked with frothy tears, as the flood swallowed the palace's golden dome. By dawn, Lyris lay in a briny wasteland, its streets a mess of mud, broken dreams, and the faint, lingering scent of melted glacier ice. Enter Auroch, the burly chieftain of the northern clan, who arrived on the scene riding a half-frozen elk that snorted like a turbocharged snowblower, with a grin that said, "I've seen worse." He gathered the survivors, brandishing a weather-worn parchment that showed ancient ice channels. Basically, nature's own plumbing schematics. "We'll turn this mess into a masterpiece," he declared, his voice echoing off the waterlogged walls like a rock ballad chorus. He rallied the strongest men and women, cracking jokes about the flood being the universe's version of a surprise spa day, while secretly plotting to redirect the deluge. The crowd, half terrified and half amused, followed him toward the frozen ridges, their boots squelching in a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a bad drum solo. Using pickaxes that sang against the ice, Auroch's crew carved a series of shallow trenches, each one a calculated sigh of relief for the raging waters. The sound of chipping ice filled the air, a sharp, metallic crack that mingled with the low, guttural growl of the torrent, nature's own battle soundtrack. When the first sluice opened, the flood obeyed, spilling like a giant soda fountain into a newly forged channel that led away from the ruined city. The rush of water was deafening, a thunderous whoosh that smelled of fresh, mineral-rich spray, washing away mud, debris, and a few unfortunate goats that made the best of the ride. Spectators cheered, half in awe, half in disbelief, as the catastrophe transformed into a controlled cascade, leaving the valley cleaner than a freshly wiped screen. Word of Aruk's icy engineering spread faster than gossip at a royal banquet, drawing tribes from the southern deserts, the forest dwellers, and even the nomadic poets who usually preferred verses over ventures. They arrived bearing gifts of honeycomb, smoked fish, and the odd portable drum set, because who doesn't need a soundtrack to a flood-turned festival? Around a massive fire, they shared stories, swapping jokes about how the gods must have been binge-watching disaster movies when they decided to dump a glacier on Lyris. Humor became the glue that stitched scarred arms together, and the once fragmented peoples discovered a common rhythm in the crackling flames and a distant, now tamed roar of water. In that moment, unity felt as tangible as the hot broth steaming in their bowls, a reminder that even the worst deluge can brew a broth of camaraderie. When the sun finally crept over the frosted horizon, it illuminated a valley reborn, still muddy, still smelling faintly of iron and pine, but alive with the chatter of 100 different dialects, mingling like a multilingual choir. Aruk stood atop a shattered column, his cloak fluttering like a banner, and chuckled. We survived a glacier's tantrum, and look, we didn't even need a superhero cape. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very ice that threatened to erase Lyris became an instrument of its revival, proving that sometimes the universe hands you a flood, and you just have to learn to surf. As the peoples began rebuilding, they sang a new anthem, a bawdy tune about water, stone, and the unexpected hero who turned a cataclysm into a communal dance. And so, the deluge of destiny earned its name, not for the ruin it wrought, but for the destiny it forged in the hearts of those who dared to redirect the tide. When the last thunder of the glacier's collapse faded, the survivors emerged onto a landscape that smelled of meltwater and mud, like a giant bathtub overflow. They huddled by the newly calm rivers, feeling the chill of the water on their skin and the slickness of ice-slick stones underfoot. A chorus of splashing boots and shouted directions filled the air as they hauled broken rafters and salvaged bricks from the wreckage. With each log they stacked, the scent of pine smoke rose, mingling with the metallic tang of fresh iron tools. By night, the flickering firelight turned the river's surface into a trembling ribbon of silver, a promise of rebirth in the darkness. Soon, the survivors traced the ghostly outlines of the glacier's former claws, carving city-states along the scarred valleys where the ice once bruised the earth. The borders were sharp as the jagged gouges left by the melt, marked by towering stone monoliths that echoed the roar of ancient waterfalls. Merchants shouted across the waterways, their carts rattling over cobblestones, slick with algae and the occasional stray fish slime. Children played tag among the ruins, stepping on cracked basalt that hissed like a kettle when a stray foot struck a hidden spring. In this patchwork of settlements, the river became both highway and lifeline, its currents humming a lullaby of commerce and conflict. Around the fire pits, Storytellers spun the legend of the melt, weaving it into a shared cultural memory that guided every decision like a compass. They described the glacier as a slumbering dragon whose tears flooded the world, a metaphor that made the elderly grin as they offered fermented kelp stew to the younger listeners. The scent of spiced broth drifted through the night, mixing with the earthy perfume of wet reeds and the faint metallic whiff of iron swords being polished. Festivals erupted each spring, where drums beat like the glacier's heart, and dancers mimicked the ripple of water with sweeping, glistening fabrics. In every chant, the phrase, "From ice, we rise," rang out, a mantra that turned survival into a sacred, slightly melodramatic creed. Ironically, the new empires grew more bureaucratic than the ice ever was, filing deeds on parchment that smelled of fresh river mud and smoked fish. Officials in powdered wigs, yes, you heard that right, debated border disputes, while a stray goat chewed on a scroll, turning legal jargon into a crunchy snack. Even the local bard joked that the whole thing felt like an episode of Game of Thrones, only with fewer dragons and more soggy boots. Citizens would toast with fermented berry wine, sloshing amber liquid onto the stone steps, declaring, "May our borders be as unmovable as a glacier, until climate change throws us a plot twist." The humor kept the mood buoyant, even when the scent of rot from forgotten floodplains lingered in the air. Through generations, the legend of the melt became a compass for architects, politicians, and farmers alike, steering them away from the folly of building on unstable ice. They learned to read the river's moods by the smell of algae blooms and the sound of distant waterfalls, letting nature whisper the best times to sow seeds or raise walls. Every sunrise painted the scarred hills in gold, reminding them that even the harshest freeze can thaw into opportunity. As children grew up hearing the tale of the glacier's tears, they carried it like a family heirloom, using it to justify treaties, wars, and the occasional daring floodgate prank. In the end, water, both gentle and relentless, scribed the destiny of these empires, and a people, ever adaptable, swam with the current rather than against it. The capital thrummed like a beehive on a hot summer day, its stone alleys clogged with market stalls, and the air tasted of spiced figs and raw human ambition. Well water sputtered like a leaky faucet, barely enough to dampen the dusty streets where children chased each other through puddles of sweat. By the third day of the month, the water shortage turned into a full-blown crisis. The scent of desperation mingled with the stench of garbage wafting from the clogged drains. The emperor, who had once ordered a statue of himself riding a dolphin, summoned his finest engineers, demanding a solution before the populace staged a revolt over parched throats. He promised gold, glory, and a throne-room view of the new marvel if they could coax a river from the distant snow-capped mountains. The engineers arrived, a ragtag crew of sand-blinded veterans and fresh apprentices, clutching scrolls that looked like they were printed by a caffeinated scribe. Their leader, an older man named Cassius, cracked a wry grin and declared, "We'll build a water highway longer than the plot of a Game of Thrones season." They spread dusty maps on a tavern table, pointing at jagged peaks that rose like the spines of ancient dragons, whispering that gravity could be their ally if they dared to harness it. Laughter erupted when a young apprentice suggested using a giant straw, only to be shushed with a mock-serious warning that the mountain spirits disliked plastic. Undeterred, the team sketched arches that would arch over valleys like giant stone ribs, promising to channel crystal-clear water straight into the thirsty city's heart. Construction began at dawn, the clang of chisels echoing off the limestone like a giant metronome ticking the empire's fate. Laborers, covered in mud and sweat, dragged massive stone blocks up steep paths, grunting as if they were pulling the curtains on a theater of doom. The foreman sang bawdy work songs that celebrated both the water to come and the inevitable bathroom breaks, their lyrics scented with goat cheese and river algae. Each arch was set with precise angles, the engineers using simple wooden plums, think level spirit sticks, as their high-tech laser pointers. When the first keystone clicked into place, a ripple of applause rose from the crowd, followed by a sudden squeal as a stray goat slipped into the half-filled trough, spitting out a fountain of foam. Weeks turned into months, and the aqueduct stretched like a skeletal spine across the countryside, its stone ribs catching the sunrise and casting long shadows over bewildered villagers. Storms hammered the worksite, hurling rain like 1,000 angry cats, and the builders sloshed through knee-deep muck, cursing the weather in a chorus that could rival a heavy metal concert. Midway, a miscalculated slope caused water to gush out like a busted soda bottle, drenching a team of apprentices who promptly declared themselves officially/wet testers. The chief engineer, never missing a chance for drama, shouted, "Fix it before the Emperor thinks we built a slip and slide." By sunset, they rerouted the channel, sealing the leak with mortar that smelled like roasted peanuts. And the city's distant cheers rose like a distant tide. Finally, the inaugural flow arrived. A crystal ribbon snaking down the stone conduit, splashing into the city's central basin with a thunderous roar that made the market vendors drop their olives in awe. Citizens gathered, their cheeks slick with tears of relief, and children danced in the spray, shouting, "Water, water," like a Netflix binge, but liquid. The Emperor, dripping with triumph, declared the aqueduct a new wonder of the world, while secretly wondering if he could now market bottled mountain water to neighboring realms. Soon, gardens bloomed. The smell of fresh rain replaced the musk of sweat, and the once parched streets glistened like polished marble. In the end, the city's thirst was quenched, but the engineers learned that power flows not just through pipes, but through the relentless chorus of a people who refuse to go thirsty. The master architect, a wiry man named Lucius, unfurled a vellum map on the marble table and warned that the new aqueduct would have to snake through cliffs as sharp as a dragon's spine. He sketched a stone conduit that would tunnel under a ridge, cross a valley, and end in the capital's thirsty plaza. Sweat dripped from his forehead, not from the summer heat, but from the knowledge that any miscalculation could flood the kingdom like a busted faucet. The council chamber hummed with the clatter of bronze goblets and the occasional snort of a senator who smelled of cheap wine. Lucius whispered, "We'll make water flow like a Netflix binge, steady, addictive, and impossible to stop." Meanwhile, the western provinces huddled like rival fan clubs, each demanding a larger share of the coming torrent. Governor Martellus sent a silver-tongued envoy who tried to charm the workers with promises of free olives, while his rival, Lady Vesta, threatened to pull tax breaks if her cup wasn't half filled first. The political intrigue thickened, smelling of incense and backroom scheming, like a soap opera set in a Roman bathhouse. Every whisper of more water for us echoed through the marble corridors, turning the project into a game of who gets the bigger splash. The Empire's power was about to be measured in gallons, not gold. At dawn, The first line of laborers, sunburned peasants, grizzled veterans, and shackled slaves, hunched over the jagged rock like a band of misfit miners from a sci-fi movie. Pickaxes sang against stone, sending clouds of dust that tasted of iron and regret into their throats. The rhythmic clang of chisel against granite became a percussive drumbeat, punctuated by occasional curses that sounded like a medieval rap battle. Sweat soaked their tunics, mingling with the stench of goat manure from nearby latrines, a reminder that glory rarely smells like roses, yet each slab they hewed out felt like laying a brick in a cathedral of power, each crack a hymn to the empire's ambition. As the days wore on, the rock proved less cooperative than a toddler refusing vegetables, splintering and collapsing in sudden, jagged avalanches. A chunk of limestone rolled down the gorge, crushing a cart of fresh figs and sending a spray of citrus-scented juice into the air. An oddly refreshing pause in the misery. Illness crept in, with fevers that turned men's faces a shade of ancient marble, and a mischievous monkey escaped from a nearby temple, stealing a bag of tools and causing a panic that resembled a Hollywood heist gone wrong. Yet the foreman kept morale high, cracking jokes about building a water gate before it was cool, and promising a celebratory banquet featuring honey-glazed pork if the aqueduct reached the river by midsummer. The irony was palpable. They were literally digging their own graves while trying to bring life to the city. Finally, after weeks of grunts, groans, and the occasional accidental splash of mud on a dignitary's pristine toga, the first rush of water surged through the stone channel, roaring like a lion awakened from a nap. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a thunderous applause that sent shivers down the spines of those who had doubted the project. Citizens gathered, eyes wide, some weeping as if a divine fountain had opened in their backyard, others checking their shoes for lingering sludge. The aqueduct stood as a blue steel ribbon of power, proof that a single daring blueprint could bend nature, politics, and human endurance alike. In that moment, the empire tasted its own reflection in the sparkling flow, clear, relentless, and a little bit wet. The sun baked the limestone cliffs like a slow-cooking pizza, while the river below chattered in a voice that sounded like 1,000 gossiping slaves. Sweat slicked the masons' foreheads, and the clink of mallets echoed against the canyon walls like a primitive drumline. Each spring, the river swelled, flooding the work site and turning fresh mortar into a soggy, stinky sludge that smelled of algae and fear. Local bandits, half-clad in goatskins, tried to sabotage the foundations by slipping wet sand into the mortar pits, giggling like kids with a busted yo-yo. Yet the Empire's crews kept on, pounding stone into place, while the sky shifted from blazing blue to ominous gray, a relentless ballet of grit and grit fingers. Enter the master engineers, whose notebooks were thicker than a Game of Thrones novel, and just as dramatic. They sketched a sweeping series of arches that rose like the ribs of a colossal, stone-chested beast, daring gravity to bite the dust. To their delight, every keystone snapped into place with a satisfying click that sounded like a final note of a rock concert, sending ripples of pride through the laborers. The arches spanned valleys so wide that a lone eagle could perch on one and still see the river grin below, a sight that made the workers swear they'd momentarily become gods of architecture. By night, lantern light flickered across the smooth curves, casting shadows that danced like phantoms of the future. The engineers weren't done with theatrics. They conjured siphons, that acted like giant drinking straws, pulling water up steep cliffs without a single pump. Imagine a colossal, bronze-coated tube, its interior polished to a sheen that reflected the sunrise like a mirror in a superhero shield. When the water surged through, it hissed and frothed, sending a misty perfume of river mud mixed with the sweet scent of crushed grapes from nearby vineyards. The pressure built like a tension-filled episode of a space opera, then released in a smooth, roaring cascade that crashed into stone basins below, shaking the very ground. Villagers watched the siphons dance and whispered that the Empire had learned to tame Poseidon's temper, all while the engineers sipped tea and corrected the flow with a casual flick of a stylus. Not everyone applauded the watery spectacle. Rival city-states sent covert saboteurs disguised as traveling bakers, slipping rotten figs into the hydraulic channels to clog the flow. The first night, the water sputtered and smacked, spraying a foamy, fish-scented spray over the guards' boots like a slapstick comedy gone sour. Engineers, however, responded with the coolness of a seasoned barista, pulling out small, brass-clad cleaning rods and whistling a Johnny tune as they cleared the blockage. Their quick fix turned the sabotage into an impromptu water show, spraying rainbows across the courtyard and leaving the saboteurs drenched and humbled. The irony hung in the air as the saboteurs, now dripping, tried to claim they'd merely tested the system, while the crowd roared louder than a stadium at a finals match. By the time the final arch was crowned, the network of stone ribs and gleaming siphons stretched across the Empire like a colossal, gleaming skeleton, pulsing with fresh water. The scent of clean, flowing water drifted through towns, washing away dust, fear, and the occasional goat smell, leaving citizens feeling as refreshed as after a good Netflix binge. Children raced along the canals, their laughter echoing off the arches, as if the stones themselves were chuckling. From mountain peaks to desert outskirts, the aqueduct proved that the Empire could carve order out of chaos, turning sheer cliffs into highways for liquid life. And as night fell, lanterns glimmered on the water's surface, casting a golden glow that made even the most stoic legionary feel like a character in a fantasy epic. A reminder that with enough arches, even the toughest sand can be tamed. On the crisp dawn that marked the grand unveiling, the marble steps of the palace buzzed like a beehive on caffeine. Servants in tunics polished the bronze seals, while the ruler, a man with a crown that sparkled more than a celebrity's Instagram filter, paced beneath the looming stone arches. Citizens gathered, clutching oil lamp flickers and freshly baked figs, their chatter a mingling of hope in the sharp tang of sweat from the summer heat. Every eye was fixed on the massive stone channel, as if it were a dragon's throat about to roar. The first surge cracked the silence, a thunderous roar that rattled the market stalls and sent a spray of mist into the air, like a busted sprinkler at a summer music festival. Crystal clear water burst from the aqueduct's mouth, slashing down the hillside in a gleaming ribbon that splashed against the bronze basins of the city's fountains. The scent of wet stone mixed with the earthy perfume of moss, and a few cheeky children plunged their faces into the torrent, shouting, "Who needs a spa day?" Even the stone statues seemed to grin, their marble chins dripping with a new sheen that made them look less like stoic guards and more like contestants on a reality show makeover. The sound echoed off the walls, a chorus of gushing applause that the ruler's trumpets tried to mimic, but the water stole the spotlight. The crowd erupted, chanting the ruler's name as if it were a chant from a stadium, while vendors tossed figs and fig skins into the air, creating a confetti rain of sweet aroma. People rushed to drink from the overflowing basins, tasting the cool, iron kiss of fresh water that made their throats feel like they'd been lubricated by a spa's essential oils. The ruler lifted his goblet, sloshing water over his sleeves, proclaiming that this flow cemented his right to rule, literally, because the city now ran on his engineering genius. A sly jester whispered, "When the pipes are working, the throne is shaking," drawing a laugh that rippled like the water's surface. Thus, the flood of triumph turned into a tidal wave of legitimacy, washing away doubts like yesterday's laundry. Across the river, rival city-states squinted at the spectacle, their own engineers furiously unrolling scrolls that read, "How to make water behave." Their envoys, looking as nervous as cats in a bathtub, dispatched messengers demanding the secret formula, only to receive a cryptic reply. It's all about pressure and pride. In the next weeks, neighboring towns tried to replicate the feat, but their makeshift channels sputtered like a broken soda fountain, spewing murky dribbles that smelled faintly of goat cheese. One particularly pompous duke bragged that his fountains would outshine the capital's, yet his first trial ended with a soggy pile of soggy socks and a chorus of disgruntled goats. The irony was as thick as the mud that clogged his pipes, and the capital watched with an amused smirk, sipping their own flawless flow. Years later, the aqueduct stood like a stone-capped superhero, its arches silhouetted against sunset, reminding every passerby that water can be both weapon and worship. Children still dared each other to raise the current, shouting, "May the best splash win," while elders recounted the inaugural day as if it were a mythic battle scene from a blockbuster. The ruler's lineage claimed the flood as proof of divine favor, a claim that even the most skeptical historian had to admit made for a good story, like a Netflix binge you can't quit. Even the rivals eventually settled for borrowing the capital's design, turning the original triumph into a shared blueprint for civilization. And so, the flood of triumph became a ripple through history, a reminder that when engineers get their act together, even a stone pipe can rock the world. When the sun burns low over the ancient valley, the stone ribs of the aqueduct rise like a broken spine against the sky. Crumbling blocks sigh under the wind, scattering centuries-old dust that smells faintly of wet earth and forgotten mortar. Sparrows flutter between the arches, their tiny feathers brushing against weathered limestone as if checking for a secret passage. Travelers pause, hand on the cool stone, feeling the pulse of history thrum beneath their fingertips, while distant goats bleat the soundtrack of a timeless pastoral scene. Modern kids, armed with smartphones and boundless curiosity, treat the ruins as the ultimate Instagram backdrop, snapping selfies that capture both the grandeur and the inevitable graffiti of a cheeky cartoon cat. Architecture students wander the site, sketching the arches while muttering about sustainable design, as if the ancient engineers had a Pinterest board titled /Epic Waterways. A local tour guide, with a wink, compares the flowing water to the Force in Star Wars, saying the Empire's power was as much about pipelines as lightsabers. The humor isn't lost on the stone. It seems to grin, its jagged edges reminding us that even marble can have a sense of irony. In that moment, the ruin becomes a living lesson, urging a new generation to dream up bridges between the past and future. Back then, the aqueduct didn't just tote water. It varied ambition, feeding fountains that glittered like sequins on a Roman gala gown. The steady creek turned parched fields into vineyards that churned out wine so sweet it could coax even a stern centurion into a dancing jig. Soldiers marched past, their sandals slapping the stone, unaware that the same channels would later carry whispers of rebellion and the occasional leaky bucket of sewage, proof that empire building can be as messy as a teenager's first kitchen experiment. Irony drips from the fact that a structure meant to glorify civilization also became the stage for its most scandalous leaks. Yet every droplet that cascaded through the arches whispered, "We shape destiny, one splash at a time." Engineers of the age wore hard hats made of laurels, wielding chisels like wizards brandishing wands, turning the dull grunt of stone into an area of arches. Their calculations were as precise as a chef seasoning a stew, sprinkling numbers about slope and gravity until the water sang a perfect, humming melody down the valley. Today, we brag about smartphones that fit in our pockets, but those ancient water highways moved more data than any Wi-Fi router. Literally, the lifeblood of empire. The scent of damp mortar still hangs in the air, a reminder that ingenuity can be both fragrant and fetid, like a freshly opened bottle of olive oil that's gone a tad too long. In every cracked pillar, you hear the echo of a silent promise. Build something that outlives your own shadow. Now, centuries later, the aqueduct stands as a weathered monument, its ruins humming with the same restless energy that once drove armies and vineyards alike. Young engineers trace their fingers along the worn channels, feeling the cool stone and hearing a distant rush that beckons them to imagine new waterways, perhaps ones that deliver renewable power instead of just wine. The story of water shaping empire endures, a reminder that a single stream can rewrite a civilization script, much like a plot twist in a binge-worthy series that nobody saw coming. The legacy of the flow is not just stone and water, but the daring belief that humanity can harness nature's pulse to rewrite destiny. So let the next generation raise their glass, filled with whatever liquid they fancy, and toast to the audacious spirit that turned a simple conduit into an eternal river of possibility. At the break of dawn, the Ganga Valley shivered in a veil of mist, the air thick with the sweet rot of wet earth and fermenting mangoes. Crickets chattered like gossiping merchants, and the reeds along the river swayed as if rehearsing a slow-motion dance. Young Asha stood on the mud-slicked balcony of her family's thatch-roofed hut, feeling the first nip of the monsoon's promise prick her skin. The river, a silver ribbon, already murmured louder, hinting at the swollen drama to come. Even the distant hills seemed to lean in, curious about the coming spectacle, like an audience waiting for the opening act of a celestial theater. When the sky began to thicken, turning a bruised indigo that swallowed the sun, Kavi, the village's wandering storyteller, shuffled forward with a cane made of bamboo and a grin as wide as a monsoon cloud. He hoisted his voice, gravelly and warm, and launched into the ancient saga of the first flood, eyes glittering like rain-splattered lanterns. Asha's ears drank in every word, her heart thumping in time with the distant roll of thunder that sounded suspiciously like a drum solo from a rock concert. The elder's tale wove humor into horror, painting the ancestors as clumsy, sand-soaked heroes who once tried to outrun water with leaky boats. The children around him giggled, half amused, half terrified, as the first drops began to tap the thatch like impatient drummers. According to Kavi, the first flood arrived not as a polite drizzle, but as a rogue wave that crashed into the kingdom, like a rogue superhero crashing a party. Think Aquaman, but with significantly less charisma. The river burst its banks, dragging goats, mud-caked carts, in the occasional bewildered farmer into a frothy chaos that smelled of algae, iron, and the unmistakable tang of panic. Elders scrambled to tie their scrolls and rescue the sacred fire, while the younger ones clung to reeds, shrieking like a chorus of misplaced opera singers. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a silt-rich carpet that glittered like gold dust, but also a stench of rotting fish that made even the bravest warriors wrinkle their noses. The survivors, shivering and soaked, swore an oath to honor the rains, realizing that they could neither outsing nor outrun the monsoon's rhythm. From that day forward, the River Kingdom learned to dance with the clouds, instead of trying to chase them away with ash-laden torches. Farmers marked their calendars with the first rumble of thunder, planting seeds in sync with the sky's sighs, as if the monsoon were a benevolent DJ, dropping the perfect beat. Offerings of fragrant marigolds and sweet rice were tossed into the ganga, a quirky thank you note that tasted like incense mixed with spilled mango juice. Children were taught to listen for the rain's applause, and even the village dogs learned to shelter under the overturned boats, wagging their tails in muddy delight. The community thrived, their harvests bursting with corn that popped like popcorn at a movie night, all thanks to that first chaotic flood that taught them humility and timing. Even now, when the clouds gather like a squad of overloaded avengers, Asha laughs, recalling Kavi's line, "If the monsoon were a Netflix binge, you'd be watching the whole season in one night. No spoilers, just endless drama." She watches the rain cascade, feeling each droplet splash against her skin like tiny high fives from the heavens. The scent of wet mud brings back memories of childhood mischief, of slipping on slick stones and shouting, "I'm the king of the river," as the water rushed past. Ironically, the very force that once threatened to drown them now waters the fields that feed their descendants, a reminder that nature loves a good plot twist. And as the final thunderclap echoes, the villagers raise their pots in salute, whispering a thank you that sounds oddly like the chorus of a pop song, because even ancient floods have a catchy hook. When the monsoon drums its first thunderous beat, the river explodes like a busted dam, spilling over its ancient banks with a roar that rattles the thatched roofs. Villagers sprint from their mud-splattered huts, hoisting bundles of straw and wet clay to patch the earthen levees that have held for generations. The air tastes of iron and fresh rain, while the distant thunder mimics the clatter of hammers on fresh wood. Children shout warnings that sound like half-hearted war cries, and even the oldest matriarchs gasp, clutching rosary beads as the water inches forward. In the chaos, the newly planted rice, still tender, still hopeful, shivers in the fast-approaching flood like a nervous freshman at orientation. Asha, the village's unofficial rain herald, meets Rohan, the burly blacksmith who smells permanently of soot and hot metal, at the timber stack that now looks more like a teetering Jenga tower. "We need enough wood to shore up the south wall," Asha demands, her voice sharp as a rain-splintered bamboo spear. Rohan grunts, swinging his hammer in the air. "And what about the forge? Without fire, we're just a bunch of soggy potatoes." Their argument crackles louder than the storm, each claim a splintered twig of communal duty versus personal survival. By the time a rain-slicked goat bumps into the pile, the villagers stare, realizing the real battle is for the very beams that will keep their homes from becoming fish tanks. The floodwater churns a brown soup of mud, wilted stalks, and the sour perfume of rotting rice, making every breath feel like inhaling a swamp's secret. Footsteps squelch in the slick mud, sending up clouds of mosquitoes that buzz like tiny, annoyed drones, while the thunder above punctuates each soggy sigh. Lanterns flicker against the deluge, their wax melting into puddles that reflect the angry sky like a broken mirror. In the distance, a lone cow moves mournfully, its low note swallowed by the roar of the river, and a stray dog paddles furiously, nose twitching at the smell of fermented straw. Even the insects seem to don tiny raincoats, scurrying under leaves that quiver as if whispering, "We warned you, you know." The whole scene could have been ripped straight from a low-budget Game of Thrones episode, minus the dragons, but with plenty of dragon-scaled rain droplets slamming the village like tiny meteors. Asha brandishes a half-broken spear, eyes glinting like a plot twist, while Rohan swings his hammer as if auditioning for a medieval heavy metal band, complete with a head-banging rhythm of clanks. Villagers whisper darkly that the gods must be binge-watching a sitcom about poorly timed hurricanes, because the timing is absurdly comic. Just as the rice sprouts, the waters decide to audition for a role in /Titanic, the sequel. Yet amid the irony, the mud-caked faces break into reluctant smiles, because nothing says lush community like sharing a laugh while your boots sink up to the knees. Even the river seems to chuckle, a gurgling giggle that rolls over the thatched roofs like a mischievous prankster. When the rain finally eases, the river retreats with the dignity of a reluctant actor leaving the stage, leaving behind a carpet of slick, glistening mud and half-submerged rice shoots. The villagers, exhausted but alive, gather around the battered timber pile, counting each splinter like a priceless relic. Asha and Rohan, still panting, exchange a grudging nod, an unspoken truce that survival beats pride every time the skies open up. They decide to replant the drowned rice, this time sowing it deeper, as if daring the water to try again. The chapter ends with the river whispering a promise of return, while the people, cheeks streaked with mud and laughter, brace themselves for the next rising tide. When the first gray clouds of the waning monsoon drifted away, a dust-wrapped column of riders burst through the ridge like a herd of over-caffeinated goats. At their head rode the virus chief, his spear glinting, his eyes flicking to the shimmering pond that the valley folk called the Mother's Mirror. "We need a share of the water," he declared, voice rolling over the crowd like a low drumbeat, while the villagers stared, nostrils filled with the sour stink of dry earth and goat dung. The request slapped the community like a sudden splash of cold water, and the elders whispered that the virus had come not for friendship, but for a drink before the rains quit. Old grudges cracked open like cracked clay pots. The Banra clan, who remembered the time a virus raider stole a prized calf and vanished into the night, muttered curses louder than the cicadas at dusk. Children perched on the thatched roofs, their eyes wide, could hear the crack of sticks being sharpened and the low growl of men swearing oaths to protect every drop of water. Even the river's murmur seemed to mutter, "Do not trust strangers with your thirst," as if the water itself had taken sides. By the third day, the sky shrugged its shoulders and refused to weep. The monsoon hiccuped and then fell silent, leaving the fields a cracked parchment of brown, and the air tasting of ash and unwashed feet. Rumors of famine sniffed through the camp like a stray dog, and every mother clutched her child's belly as if it were a sack of grain. The virus grew restless, their drums beat in a frantic rhythm that sounded like a heart in panic, while the Banra's fire pits puffed out bitter smoke, each puff a silent accusation. Fear, tangled with mistrust, forming a knot tighter than a hunter's rope around the whole valley. Enter Kavi, the village's reluctant peacemaker, who wielded words like a seasoned juggler tosses flaming torches, sometimes spectacular, sometimes singed. He called a council beneath the ancient banyan, its roots smelling of damp rot and old secrets, and asked each side to speak, promising to record their grievances on leaf parchment with ink made from berry juice. The virus chief, eyes squinting like a cat, watching a laser pointer, admitted that his people feared dying of thirst more than he feared losing a battle, a confession that made a few Banra warriors snort in disbelief, as if they'd heard a plot twist in a binge-watch series. Kavi then suggested a truce. Each clan would draw water in alternating turns, sharing the pond like two siblings, fighting over the last slice of pizza, with the promise that whoever left the most empty jars would host the next season's feast. Laughter, shaky as a newborn goat, rippled through the crowd, and even the sky seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the fragile peace would hold longer than a TikTok trend. The agreement held, albeit with the tension of a stretched rubber band. Mornings smelled of fresh mud and the occasional whiff of burnt offerings, while evenings echoed with the soft clink of water jars being passed like secret love notes. Mothers sang lullabies that blended the rain's distant growl with a cicada's chirp, a lullaby that could coax even a stubborn buffalo into a nap. Yet, as clouds gathered lazily on the horizon, the Varus scouts whispered that the wind carried the scent of distant storms, a reminder that nature could flip a script faster than a superhero flick. Kavi stood at the pond's edge, his silhouette a dark brushstroke against the silvered water, and whispered to the heavens, "May your drops be generous, and may our grudges be as fleeting as a meme." The sky, stubborn as ever, kept its veil of gray, but the valley breathed easier, knowing that even in drought, a fragile truce can be more nourishing than a barrel of rain. When the sky cracked open like a busted dam, the monsoon poured down with the fury of 1,000 drums. The river, normally a lazy silver snake, turned into a churning beast that smashed the earthen levees with a roar louder than a war cry. Mud and rotten leaves rose in a choking cloud, smearing the air with the scent of wet soil and fermenting crops. Villagers clutched at their thatched roofs, eyes wide as saucers, as the water surged like a living thing, swallowing pathways and wheat fields alike. The valley, once a cradle of harvest, became a bathtub for the gods, sloshing with debris, splintered wood, and the occasional terrified goat in the chaos. Asha sprinted toward the highest thatch, her sandals slick with muck and her hair plastered to her forehead. She found a ragged cluster of children huddled on a rooftop, their cheeks flushed with fear and the stench of soaked mud. With a grin that cut through the gloom, she shouted, "Grab my rope. We're going to turn this into a water slide." She hoisted them, one by one, the rope creaking like an old pirate ship's mast under strain. As the last giggle echoed above the flood, Asha dove back into the torrent, emerging, dripping yet triumphant, as if she'd just survived a real-life splash zone at a theme park. Meanwhile, Rohan was hacking his way through a wall of water when his foot struck something hard and cold. He brushed away the slime to reveal a smooth stone channel, ancient as the first sunrise, etched with symbols that looked suspiciously like doodles of a fish and a sun. "Ash, Grandpa left us a secret plumbing system," Rohan muttered, wiping muck from his eyes, half amused, half amazed at the ancestral ingenuity. He knelt, feeling the cool stone under his palm, and whispered a quick thank you to the long-gone engineers who must have loved practical jokes. With a fierce yank, he pulled the hidden gate open, and water began to spill into the carved conduit, sighing like a relieved dragon, finally exhaling. The channel gulped the flood like a thirsty beast, diverting the surge away from the crowded village heart and toward the lower fields, where the crops could soak up the excess. Villagers gathered, forming a human chain, passing buckets, shouting encouragements that sounded like a medieval chant meets a modern-day pep rally. Children who had escaped Asha's rooftop rescue cheered, splashing each other in the receding tide, while the elders nodded, eyes glistening with pride and a hint of tears. The water roared through the stone, carving its own melody, and the valley's panic transformed into a synchronized dance of survival. In that moment, the disaster became a spectacular showcase of collective heroism, as if the whole community had turned into an Avengers squad, only with spears and sandals. When the clouds finally cleared, the valley lay soaked, strewn with broken reeds, stray fish, and the lingering perfume of wet earth that made even the toughest farmer sigh in contentment. Asha, dripping but radiant, stood beside Rohan as they surveyed the aftermath, their boots squelching in the mud like soggy marshmallows. They laughed, recalling how the flood turned the whole settlement into an impromptu water park, minus the lifeguards, and plus a lot of heroic drama. The ancient stone channel, now humming with a gentle trickle, stood as a silent reminder that even in the wildest storms, clever ancestors had left breadcrumbs of safety. And so, the story of the Great Deluge was whispered around firelight for generations, a tale as thrilling as any superhero saga, but with more mud and fewer capes. When the last roar of the flood faded, the survivors huddled on a mud-slick plain that smelled of wet earth and burnt reeds, like a campfire gone rogue in a rainforest. They dragged the ancient stone channel, a rusted artery of the old world, back into place, with elbows creaking and voices coughing through the damp air. The clatter of chisels against basalt echoed like a drumbeat that summoned the gods of water and stone. Children splashed in the shallow puddles, squealing as they chased each other's reflections, while elders muttered curses at the lingering stink of rotting grain. In that gritty tableau, the promise of a new beginning pulsed louder than any flood warning horn. Soon, the village elders carved a monsoon calendar onto a slab of limestone, each notch a reminder of when the sky would weep and when the sun would grin. They marked planting moons with charcoal, aligning them to the river's size so that barley would sprout just as the first raindrop tapped the thatched roofs. Traders from distant dunes arrived with spice sacks that smelled of cumin and cumin-filled jokes, swapping goods for the fresh, flood-kissed rice. The calendar became a communal heartbeat, its ticking, soft scratches on stone, guiding harvest festivals that smelled of fermented dough and fresh fish. Even the goats seemed to nod in agreement, their hooves clacking against the dry earth like a low-budget percussion ensemble. As the years swelled, the story of the Great Flood morphed into a rite of remembrance, performed every third year with the flair of a reality TV showdown. Villagers donned mud-splattered cloaks and reenacted the deluge, slipping on banana leaves while chanting, "Remember the rain," louder than a stadium announcer. The elders tossed fermented palm wine into the river, the sour tang slicing through the heavy humidity like a punchline in a comedy sketch. Young boys, cheeks puffed with salty spray, tried to outscream the thunder, only to be shushed by grandmothers who warned, "Save your lungs for the harvest dance." The irony was delicious. They celebrated the catastrophe with joyous grime, proving that even misery can wear a glittery costume. From that day forward, every child learned to read the sky the way a modern gamer reads a loading screen, watching clouds shift, listening for the distant rumble, and feeling the electric buzz in their fingertips. They grew up tasting rainwater on their tongues, a metallic tang that reminded them of iron swords and sweet mangoes alike. When the first seedling broke through the cracked soil, the whole village inhaled the scent of fresh growth, as if the world itself had taken a deep, satisfied breath. The monsoon calendar, now etched in bronze, became a family heirloom, passed down like an embarrassing selfie that everyone pretended not to cringe at. In honoring the rains, they honored their own stubbornness, turning every droplet into a teacher who demanded both reverence and a good punchline. So each year, as the clouds gather and the wind whistles a tune that sounds suspiciously like a vintage sitcom laugh track, the villagers gather to harvest and to remember. They raise their cups, filled with fermented barley brew that bubbles like a cauldron of gossip, and toast the heavens with a toast that would make even a Marvel superhero raise an eyebrow. The rains, once feared as a monstrous beast, now sit at a feast like an uncle who tells the same story at every reunion, annoying but oddly comforting. And whenever the first thunder cracks, a teen in a bright woven shirt mutters, "Winter is coming, but make it monsoon," borrowing a line from a famous fantasy series to prove that even ancient peoples could be meme savvy. In the end, the harvest of memory is not just grain and grain store. It's the lingering scent of mud, the echo of laughter, and the stubborn hope that the next flood will be just enough to water the jokes.